Hello, everybody. Hi. If we can get going, we're at 2 o'clock. I'm sure there'll be some more people to drip feed in as we go. But it is time for our really exciting event today with the Centre for Progressive Policy and Local Trust on how we can bring more better quality jobs to England's most disadvantaged neighbourhoods. An absolutely critical task of this government. Taking place in this fantastic People's History Museum in Manchester, the event is coinciding with our report launch today, and hopefully you've all got big copies on your seats of our 55-page report and all the huge amount of work that's gone into that on doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods. And these are communities, and we'll hear a lot more about this, how we're defining it, that face both high levels of material deprivation and low levels of social, civic, capital and infrastructure. So we're going to be revealing some of the report's findings and some of our policy recommendations that offer a blueprint for government to help these neighbourhoods thrive. There's going to be representatives from communities involved in the project who will be speaking alongside some great speakers who I'll introduce shortly. It's going to be about 2 hours, so we'll have a summary first of the research, then we're going to have a detailed panel discussion before we open it up to have lots of time for Q&A later on as well. But just very quickly, so why are we doing this? So I should say, I am Ben Franklin. I'm interim CEO of the Centre for Progressive Policy. We're absolutely delighted to have worked with Local Trust on this really important project. It blends all of our practice, policy, research, engagement functions across both organisations in a really imaginative way. We've not only done original data research, we've spoken to people, real people, residents, we've spoken to people who run big locals, we've also spoken to members of what is our inclusive growth networks. This is 14 local and combined authorities that we host who right at the forefront of inclusive growth and economic development policy across the UK. We've spoken to local government officers as part of all of this. So it really is a real sort of landmark report. And I know that Local Trust are now going to be introducing their commission on neighbourhoods as well, which will take a lot of this agenda forward as we go into the future. But, you know, if this is going to be a mission-driven government that cares about growth, that cares about opportunity, then changing the lives of people who live in these doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods is going to be absolutely critical marker of success and something we absolutely double down on within the report and the project itself. So, who are we going to be hearing from today? So we're going to be hearing from Rachel Rowney, the Chief Operating Officer at Local Trust. We'll be hearing from Professor David Halpern, who is going to be joining the Commission on Neighbourhoods. We're going to be hearing from Sarah Crozier, Associate Professor from the Centre for Decent Work and Productivity at Manchester Metropolitan University. Mckenna, Regional Secretary, TUC North West of England. And Jeanette Harold, Community Representative for Big Local and Director of Continuum. So lots and lots to get through, and hopefully we can have fantastic discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to bring Dan on to reveal all the findings from our paper and to get us started. Thank you very much.
I am not Ben Franklin. I am Daniel Turner, the Head of Research and Analysis at the Centre for Progressive Policy. It's lovely to be with you all here in one of the nicest spaces I've ever spoken to. At the People's History Museum in Manchester. It falls to me to try and establish the baseline of knowledge from the report in front of you and to inform the conversation that we're about to hear from colleagues who will be joining us on the panel. So, as Ben has already said, I have the luxury of being able to unpack what exactly we mean when we talk about a doubly disadvantaged neighbourhood. So these are places, as defined by our colleagues at OCSI, that are both in the bottom decile on the index of multiple deprivation, so they face high levels of material deprivation across a whole host of metrics, and the bottom decile of the Community Needs Index, which is defined by OCSI, which is a measure of social infrastructure, civic assets, connectivity, but essentially, when we move away from abstract nouns, this is a question of, in your neighbourhood, do you have a sense of strong identity? The answer overwhelmingly is actually yes. This is in relative terms, right? So a lot of these communities do feel a strong sense of pride, a strong sense of community. But what we observe is that they tend to see far fewer physical assets like village halls, parks, access to green space. They face fewer access opportunities into transport. They might face lower levels of funding for community groups than peer communities. About 2.3 million people across England live in communities that fall into both of those bottom deciles, the doubly disadvantaged communities that we're talking about here. And as you can see from the map on the right there, it's a little bit blurry, so each purple dot is one of these local communities. We're defining it at quite a local level here. It's LSOAs for the people who are into the Office for National Statistic data sets. But I think the common sense way of thinking about it is this is roughly like your estate or your immediate neighborhood. It's about 1,000 to 3,000 people. It's where you would say to someone who knows your town or your city fairly well, like, I'm from such and such, they would know what this place is. And you can see that geographically, they're really clustered around a lot of the urban areas of the North and Midlands, as well as coastal communities all around the country, but notably not in the southeast and some of the major southern metropolitan areas. So what have we done, and what has led to the report in front of you all today? It's a mixed methods piece of work based on quantitative research that myself and my colleague Tanya Singh from CPP largely led on, coupled with, I think most importantly, talking to people from big locals, talking to practitioners in local government, combined authorities, national government, who have been trying to grapple with this question of how do we diagnose the challenges facing these communities and what actually works in supporting them. And then focus groups with just ordinary people who maybe wouldn't come through a big local network, maybe have never heard of it, would never think of the New Deal for communities or any of the policy frameworks that have been developed over the decades, to get their sense of what life feels like to them, and in particular what life in the workplace looks like and feels like. So let me start with that question, which is, what is good work as defined by the people we spoke to in doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods? So this is in the document in front of you somewhere. I won't go through it step by step, but essentially what people say when they think about good work is we want to make sure that we're not earning poverty pay, that we have some security over our terms and conditions, and also ideally some flexibilities if we need to be able to drop the kids off or whatever it might be. We also want to be in somewhere that feels like it's a source of fulfillment for us, that it's a source of community for us, and that we think reflects our sense of justice and values. And ideally, we'd want to see an opportunity to progress. Can I be here for 5-10 years, make a career, see a training pathway for myself? But generally, what I would say is, first of all, this is what you hear from everyone. This isn't distinctive to doubly disadvantaged communities. This is also very much in line with what you hear from the various policy reviews into good work. The policy statements from the new government are all aligned with this. And we shouldn't be surprised, because people who live in doubly disadvantaged communities are just like the rest of us. But what came through in the focus groups very clearly was, first of all, a sense that even those fundamental criteria weren't often available to people looking for work in doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods, and that really these bottom two do most of the work. You know, people aren't always expecting that from tomorrow everyone's going to have brilliant careers, but if you can just get some of these basics fixed, if you can get access to work, if you can get basic security and equity in the workplace, that would go a long way. So against that, how do the economies of doubly disadvantaged places actually measure up? The first thing to say is that even relative to other deprived communities, so this is other communities that face the same material levels of disadvantage, communities that are doubly disadvantaged have a whole host of economic problems. So in headline terms, they're about half as productive as other deprived communities. And that gap's widened over time. Part of the reason for that is that there are only about half the number of jobs per resident in doubly disadvantaged communities compared to other deprived communities. So just the chance of you having access to a job in the place that you live is far lower if you live in one of these communities compared to anywhere else in England. And not just that, but not only do you not have jobs on your doorstep, it's harder for you to access jobs elsewhere in your wider economy, in the rest of the town and the rest of the city. Sorry. Having trouble with the clicker, I think. There we go. So why is that the case? If the headline terms are, there is something distinctive that's happening about the economy in these doubly disadvantaged communities, what's causing that? What's causing it to be persistent over time, and what's preventing there being catch up with other communities in the area? Well, for one thing that we observe now, there are far larger problems with health in doubly disadvantaged communities. You can see here that people are far more likely to report themselves as being in bad health or not in good health compared to peer communities. And that shows up in the data as well. So you're much more likely, if you're in a doubly disadvantaged community, to not be in work because of inactivity. And as in the country as a whole, that's risen over time. For other deprived communities, it's actually slightly fallen over the past decade. So there is a real difference between the communities that have access to the civic infrastructure and assets compared to those that don't. Likewise, there are problems with access to childcare. So this is a measure, the lower down the bar, the lower the number of available childcare places there are in your community. So we see it's a problem for all types of deprived communities that they have less access to childcare as well. So how do we analyze this in the report? We say that taking it together, there's a whole set of complex factors that are reinforcing one another and make it very difficult for any given community or any given person within a community to break out of a pathway that they may find themselves in. Part of that is that the jobs aren't there, the pay isn't there, the security isn't there, and therefore the incentive for you as a resident to invest in skills, or for you as a would-be entrepreneur to set up a business, is lower than it would be in other communities. Part of this is a story around transport, as I already mentioned, and about health. And something that really came through in the qualitative work we did is a sense of declining trust. So the community bonds are strong within doubly disadvantaged neighborhoods, but the sense of, do I trust the job center? Whenever I've been there, it's been a punitive experience. I've been asked to, justify things that are quite stressful for me or whatever it might be. So why would I ever go to the job center for help with my CV or for a retraining program? One of the things we heard time and time again in the focus groups was, when I think about the opportunities that are available to me, or who do I trust when it comes to understanding how I can move into better work, look into a jobs market, it would be the other parents at the school's gates when you're picking up your kids. It wouldn't be, I'll go to the job centre or I'll listen to a local government officer. And then there are some policy failures that we see in the system related to, for instance, ill health, NHS waiting lists, all of the sort of things that you would read about on a day-to-day basis in the papers, and some comments around the design of the welfare system as well at the moment, and the point at which it makes less sense to move into universal credit from some forms of disability-related benefits because of the post-COVID transition. So what can we do about it? Essentially, we make three kind of broad sets of recommendations in the paper. The first is recognize that this is a problem and recognize that government can do something about it. So we're talking about there being a national program for neighbourhood renewal that targets directly the challenges that are complex and interdependent facing doubly disadvantaged communities. I think essentially the model we have in mind here is something like the New Deal for Communities from the 2000s, which I'm sure we'll talk about as the panel goes on, which is large scale in terms of funding, is long term, and brings together policy teams locally, regionally, nationally, across different departments to try and tackle the underlying root causes of some of these challenges. But we recognize that needs funding. So this is where it starts to get a little bit techie, but we are in the run-up to the budget. We're not too far away from the spending review. There are programs that are already operating that do this sort of work, like the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, Levelling Up funds, and so on. What we think their replacement needs to do is have dedicated funding that says doubly disadvantaged communities need to receive X amount of this money, and it's not sufficient to say, well, if the economy as a whole is doing well in Greater Manchester, that will trickle out, and the rising tide will pick up all boats in some of the doubly disadvantaged communities. Because one of the statistical things that we do in the report is show that isn't true, that you don't get that same level of geographic spillover into doubly disadvantaged communities as you do into other places. So, in fact, if we just got Greater Manchester's economy or South Yorkshire's economy, where I'm from, or the North East economy as a whole, firing on all cylinders, that would actually increase inequality between doubly disadvantaged and other communities in their area. So we need this to be ring-fenced, even if it's still, inevitably, and it makes sense for other reasons, this is delivered at a regional level through mayors, through local authorities, to make sure the money does go to where it's needed. We also think this final point I'm going to come on to next around the Community Wealth Fund, which is there's an opportunity here to learn from the shortcomings of previous policy approaches, which have ended up being quite driven out of central government, driven by Whitehall, by policy goals that are set nationally that don't necessarily, as much as they could do, take into account local or regional variation. And in particular, it's often, or it can be perceived as, things are being done to you rather than you are an active participant in this. Anecdotally, I remember when I was a kid, I lived in a community that I now would label as doubly disadvantaged. And in the New Deal for Communities period, one day, some council officers just came around and installed security alarms on every single house in the estate that we lived in. And it was, they were all either council-owned or former council housing, because someone had decided in our area it was antisocial behavior that was the problem, and the solution was everyone should have a security alarm, and we were happy to take it, but it didn't really tackle some of the, the things that we would have prioritized. So how do we make sure that communities themselves are properly organized, can articulate what it is that matters to them, and then can engage on their own terms when it's the local government officer or the combined authority mayor who comes knocking? And Big Local, the work the local trust has been doing, I think is emblematic of what those sorts of interventions could look like. That was a whistle-stop tour. There's loads in there. I urge that you read the report. Even the report doesn't do full justice to the depth of insights that we got, especially the qualitative depths. So I'm really looking forward to the panel to bring out some of that nuance and complexity. You may have questions from the presentation I've just given. I will be around after. I'll also be around during the panel Q&A. So if you wanted to say, oh, could you define that point or get into more detail, I'm very happy to just pop up from this front table and answer any questions you have. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel, and then we'll have the panel.
Thanks, Dan. Very loud. That's great, and really useful to have that summary before we go into the discussion. In a moment, I'm going to ask all the panel members to introduce themselves rather than me do that. I think if I did that, we'd be here for about 20 minutes going through a very long list of CVs. I'm Rachel. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Local Trust, and thank you for joining us today. As Dan went through in terms of the report, lots in there and lots to unpick, and we're going to open it up for questions in about 20 minutes after we've had a bit of a discussion between us, trying to unpick some of the experiences of the panel in this respect. What I wanted to do was kick off with a question for the whole panel. Okay, so particularly hearing what Dan said and the slide that sort of summarised some of the experiences of the doubly disadvantaged communities, thinking about ill health, lack of access to support around caring, and feeling that even when there is growth in the economy, either nationally or regionally, it doesn't reach the communities that are most disadvantaged. So when you introduce yourself, would it be really useful if you told, I suppose, us, the audience, how do you break that cycle? How do you get jobs, good jobs, into those communities and into those places? I've been told you've only got 2 minutes for this. We might need a bit longer. So feel free to, I think just to kickstart it, based on the recommendations, what you've heard, what do you think the answer is based on your experiences? And Jay, since you're sitting right next to me, I'm going to look to you first.
No pressure. So I'm Jay, I'm the Regional Secretary for the TUC in the Northwest, so bring together our 48 TUC affiliated trade unions representing around 800,000 workers across the region, and I look at those dots, and a bit like Dan, I look at dots on that map and see essentially where I'm from, where I live, and many areas of the Northwest we represent. For me, it's important we're talking about this. It's been important as trade union movements around the Make Work Pay, New Deal for Work and agenda. But I think, as we were talking about before, Rachel, I think for me, how you make some of this happen is I think we've got to be a little bit brave. I think we've got to have some intervention, and we direct jobs to places, not just seeking that employers say we want to locate here and we give them tax breaks or incentives. We've got to, if they're getting our public money, they've got to go where we want them to go, where reasonably possible. And I think we keep saying, and we talk about Greater Manchester and the Good Employment Chart, and I'll touch on in my contribution, is making every pound that we spend work that little bit harder for us, that it doesn't just create a job, it doesn't just pay someone's wages, but the money that goes into businesses will help with the skills, will help with childcare, will actually make a real difference, not just we give a tax break or a tax incentive or a investment from a local authority to a business to locate there. They've got to do a little bit more for their money, because there's a huge amount of challenges, and well, as this outlines, we've got to go some way to start and to address them.
Thanks, Jay. And that's an interesting point we're going to come back to about the role of businesses and organisations along with government in this space as well. Sarah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Crozier. I'm a researcher in the Centre for Decent Work and Productivity. I'm also a psychologist, and so my field of work is really engaged with understanding the individual experience within the workplace, or indeed at many different points across that process of getting into work, getting into good work, staying in work, and its intersections with health. So for me, we need to do two things in a simple sense. The first thing we need to do is create more good jobs, but we also need to transform the existing bad jobs, if you like, because there's still lots of them. And so in our work within Manchester, and indeed in lots of different localities, we are still seeing the impact of bad jobs on individuals, poor psychological and physical health, and those things are really long-standing and they're really problematic, and there's a bigger sort of socialisation piece here in terms of how we change that landscape. So this is very much an inclusion issue, and we have a responsibility at all of those different levels within that system, from our individual experiences of interacting with work all the way through to some local level initiatives, and I know we'll pick that up in some other parts of the conversation as well. But I think that we need to remove some of those barriers, and for me there's some really important psychological barriers in terms of the sort of damage that happens when we encounter either bad jobs or when we don't have a job that perhaps we need or would like. So there's a bigger piece around role models, socialisation and leadership, and we need to be able to mirror that lived experience so that when you come into an organisation, that good job is created for you because people who work alongside you or champion you or who support you from lots of different places have a genuine understanding of how difficult things have been. And I think it's about the consequences of that agenda, and we're still not really getting there in understanding how difficult the workplace can be if you have had those struggles of either a bad job in any context, or certainly when you map that onto this existing challenge of being within a doubly disadvantaged or forgotten about locality.
Thanks, Sarah. So much to come back to at that point, especially around the isolation and individuals within that. David.
Hi, I'm David Halpern. I used to be a respectable academic, I was like confessed, but I've been in government and policy on and off. I did 6 years with Tony Blair, for example, when some of this was going on, and worked indeed with Baroness Armstrong, who's going to be chairing the local trust-sponsored independent commission on neighbourhoods, which is very exciting and a very good time to do it. I mean, of course, you see the echo from the previous New Deal was 1998, a year into the administration. Well, good time to do it. You asked a pretty difficult question. That's all right. Well, that's the whole point, right? 3 very quick points. I mean, one is, and Dan kind of captured it almost visually, like the sense that even when you do get economic growth, there seems some places that it doesn't get to. And it's worth remembering, even the original New Deal for communities, with the really substantial sums, in the final review they concluded there were a number of areas that didn't seem to work. And they basically were periphery areas, which are many of the same ones we're talking about now. So even when you had New Deal. So some of it seems to be just brutal connectivity. And so people like Henry Overman would talk about, the first thing, for God's sake, just physically do the connections. Or Andy Burnham, what Andy Burnham? I'm talking to him a couple of years ago. He's like, you're just so desperate to get control of the buses, right? Because how can it be you've got these areas where it's £5 to go into town and there's a bus once or twice a day? It's like, the connectivity looks like it's really important, and maybe much more important than some of the expensive ticket items of rebuilding, etc. The second one, very briefly, is social capital. Maybe we'll come back to it, but basically this is one of the sort of things we all know in our lives is very important, but government doesn't seem to have discovered it, right? The social networks that you live in are incredibly important. In particular, again, Dan was alluding to, we might have strong bonds, but the language is often used, but you're bridging social capital. The weak ties may be weak. And there's a lot of evidence now, not least from the US most recently, that this is even more important than we thought it was. Many of you would have got jobs because of people you know. And even the reference, by the way, the school gates, well, who are in those networks, right? So it really matters. The final thing, just putting a marker on, I think there are new possibilities. There are, of course, because of the internet, although again, notice the low penetration in some of these areas, but linked to it also, there's a kind of, if I can call it, political opportunity, which the last 14 years has been a sort of view on markets, which markets just kind of work, and the best thing government could do is get out of the way and they'll sort themselves out. Well, we already know there's a problem in this, literally, geography, but it's actually much more widespread than that. And so one of the really big issues, which I think is also an opportunity, which is that how do you know if it's good work? How do you find it? How do you know whether working for local trust is great and, it's not just how much you'll get paid, but what's the progression opportunities? Is the boss going to be a nightmare? Are you going to walk into the office, right? Like in the sense of the TV program. It's really consequential. It's very hard to know. So this is a widespread problem across the economy. It's called shrouding. So you can't tell key attributes. And if you just believe markets clear themselves, then it's not a problem. But if you look at the long tail of low productivity, if you're a classic economist, it shouldn't be there. Why is it still there? Right? It means that you should be able to buy a product which is better quality or better price. You should be able to get a better job if you move up. And investment shouldn't be there. So why the hell it's still there? It's the mother of all market failures that is all around us day in, day out. So let me just leave that hanging. But I think there are new ways of attacking that if you've got a political will and interest to do so.
We're going to come back to that. And for the record, working at local trust is great. Yeah. So I want to come back to a lot of that, including the NDC point and how we can learn from past experiences. But Jeanette, over to you just to introduce.
Right, thanks very much. I'm Jeanette Harold, and I'm a community practitioner and manager of some 40 years. I'm absolutely bloody ancient. And I have worked with local trust and for local trust since inception. In fact, before local trust was actually local trust. So my reach goes right back. Anyway, without doubt for me, community empowerment makes a real positive difference to the trajectory of double deprived neighbourhoods. And just to put out context, what usually happens in my experience, my little analogy that I use, local government or health trusts are the power source. They make the decisions on local finances, health, empowerment, etc. And they say, we're going to empower the communities. But to do that, we need to get closer to them and give them a voice. And that sounds good, but it's often an illusion. And reality is that they've plugged an extension lead into their power source and taken a light out into the communities. So the power source is still the same, but the communities are more illuminated. Getting closer means in proximity too. And as a community development practitioner for 40 years, I've seen us start from beginning to beginning to beginning. Perhaps learning some lessons, but really applying that learning. And the reasons for this would take up another panel discussion. However, I'd assert that community development is intrinsic to change in the empowerment and its successful application. To change, Yes, it's intrinsic to changing the trajectory through plugging the gap between the idea of empowerment and its successful application. Every report tells us that local people need social capital through capacity building. But this takes real time spent getting to know the people and investing in their development so that they can feel confident and recognised as decision makers. Big Locals was successful in doing this in some areas, but it's also important that the services take note of the barriers and obstacles communities identify and work with them to overcome them. Indeed, the services also need to be skilled up in interacting with the communities and listening to what they have to say. The blame culture also needs to be overcome. They don't want jobs, their kids are feral. You'll never amount to anything. They're only interested in drugs and drink, and include communities themselves who can use it against their own people. Also, they need leaders who are not just part of the great and the good of their community, who are often themselves barriers, or are national voluntary sector organisations who disappear as soon as the money does. But people who can bring others together, who can motivate, paint visions, listen and take communities forward. Turnover of people is also important. Chairs shouldn't sit there for years. They should be bringing other people through. I believe the programme of neighbourhood renewal should include community development as a nationally recognised statutory service which is adequately funded, having access to high quality training and embrace the values of community development. And in the words of Lao Tzu, go to the people, live with them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build with what they have, but with the best leaders, when the work is done, the task accomplished, the people will say, we have done it ourselves.
Thanks, Jeanette. You really usefully took us back to some of the learning, actually, and how I suppose for a lot of people the messages from the report will feel very familiar. They won't feel like we're going over new ground, and people will be involved in, as Dan mentioned, the neighbourhood renewal programmes, which David also mentioned. So starting off with looking back before we look forward, David, you talked about the New Deal for communities and how it did work in some areas, not all areas, but the world has changed. That was 25, 30 years ago. What now, looking forward about what a new programme could look like in a new context, what do you think is now different about, I suppose, the world, the context we're in, and what other types of levers that are there now that weren't there back then that could make it more successful? Or what other things that we can no longer do that we could do back then? Like, where's the balance?
Right, sticking with the easy questions, eh? Well, just a quick comparison, because, the New Deal community is obviously a very powerful reference point, is worth remembering, and we should learn from it. But just do the numbers a tiny bit, just to put it in context. So, 39 communities, it was just under 400,000 people in total that were covered by it. Those 39 communities typically got 60 to 70 million each, including crowded-in funding, and that was a tenth. If you did the same numbers now, and you just said 2.3 million, so that's 12 to 15 billion. Well, you may be very persuasive, but good luck with Rachel and the Chancellor on that one. That's a lot of money to do a literal lift, right? But what would be grounds for optimism? I think number one, and this is obviously what the Commission will need to look at with your help, but is to try and figure out what the key active ingredients are. So there's a strong suspicion, and to put it slightly unfairly, is that it replicated to some extent almost the classic errors of slum clearance, which is you see the physical issue and that's what you try and fix, the buildings, and it's expensive, as opposed to, and you can't see the social fabric, including its value, by the way. So let me just make 2 points then. One is that there's a prospect of trying to be more precise in identifying the active ingredients. So, Dan and Ben have made the argument basically here, which is let's really focus particularly on employment. Now, that was in New Deal for Community, but it was one of the issues on the kind of the third, So if you bring it to the fore, well, maybe that's really right, and it will take you to a more focused set of levers. And I think that is quite likely. And even when the physical interventions were done, some bits which are cheaper are the effective bit. So maybe Andy's right about for God's sake, just spend the money on a lot of buses. Maybe that's like really fix the connectivity on that side. What's the efficacy on it? But on the new bit, just at least put a toe in the water. So I think it's fixable. I actually have failed repeatedly to persuade ministers in recent years, but we may be able to do it. So seriously, how would you know if it's a good place to work? Or put it the other way, if you're an employer and you're a really good employer, right, and you actually really support progression, and you try and give people support, and you know, to put it in awful terms, you know, you're not an unpleasant manager. It's really valuable to people, you know. If you can, here's a simple Gallup question. One of the best predictors, not just of, you know, your work satisfaction, but your life satisfaction. If you are asked the question, thinking of your immediate supervisor, would you describe them like a boss or a partner? Right? It's a really simple question. You can think about that yourself. If you can say the answer is partner, it's associated with about a 30% increase in your, it's massive increase in your life satisfaction, equivalent to a 30% increase in your earnings. It's a really big effect size. What a surprise. But how would you discover until after you work for this person what they're like? So my view is it's an illustration of a lever you can use, which is that DWP would literally hold, with HMRC, loads of information about pay, the number of people exit firms, pay progression. If you think about it, and you can, in principle, you can de-shroud it so that you can go to a job platform and you would immediately be able to see who's a great employer. So if you are a good employer, you would actually get better employees applying to you, and your bad firms get under much, much more pressure. So now you're harnessing and catalyzing market forces. So it just gives you a glimpse into a world which you could do that kind of thing, as well as, sort of the final obvious point, is that geography itself can be unlocked a bit, right? So one of the puzzles is, why don't catch-up variables work better? They work across countries. Why don't they work inside countries better? Why don't those areas you're talking about, why aren't people turning up and saying, well, look, great, there's a whole load of people who we can probably employ us less than we are in London, and, you know, why isn't it happening? Well, clearly the internet potentially unlocks some of those capacities. So the geography is loosened, that's constraints. So there are new possibilities there that weren't there 10, 15 years ago.
Thanks, David. And one of the points, I might come back to you, Jay, because beforehand you told me a really interesting story about a warehouse and working with them to do some of the things that David had talked about in a very specific sense. Jeanette, going to you though, and I think, David, you made the point around, I suppose, particularly in NDCs, there was a focus and quite a lot of money that went on capital projects. And then the question, which then comes back to the point you made a minute ago, Jeanette, around the investment in community development. And just from your experience, I don't know whether you have a story or an area where you can bring that to life a bit for us, because I think the principles are all there, they're fairly well, I think, rehearsed and understood, but where you've seen a real impact of people in a place doing some of this work and making impact around jobs and mental health.
Yeah, from years ago, I saw kids that never got picked up anywhere because there wasn't the pathways. I think some places now have pathways, and some places have people who are concerned about their communities and want to do something about it. And one area, that's Bishop Auckland, Goneless Gateway. Two things we did there. One was give out bursaries to individuals, and that included things like driving tests, driving lessons. I also did that in another of my areas. And the other one was they looked around and picked up on an organisation called Trades for Care, which was started by two businessmen who had to take time out to look after members of their family, and they realised that there was a gap between tradespeople and the care professions. So they started up Trades for Care. Initially it was just painting and decorating, but they then worked with colleges and other organisations around them, and they've also got young people who have neurodiversities, etc., as well, working with them, and they have taken them in and given them just a shot at doing things. And one of the people there, Cameron, she was their first trainee, and she's now a director of the company with them. And that's a progress. That's people working in partnership. That's something real, and it's something that is now being held up in the area as really good practice. Conversely, in another estate I worked in many years ago, there was a kid there, Jimmy Taggart, remember his name, and he was really good mathematically. He was really good at meeting people and sorting things as well. He was great at, by 16, he was ringing cars and selling drugs, and he was making a lot of money. And there was nowhere for him to take. I said to a colleague at the time, if he'd have been born into another house, another family, he'd have been in the city now. That's how good he was. So if we don't have the pathways to give to these people, and I'm talking particularly about young people with these examples, but I'm talking about any age groups, we forget that people in some estates have got four generations of unemployment. They have no idea about turning up places on time, about doing it day after day, about that investment, and they get judged for it. So for me, it's about starting with the people. It's about finding out what they really want, and instead of imposing what we think they want on them.
Thanks, Jeanette. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to act as a bit of a bridge between what Jeanette's saying and what David's saying. So David's sort of kind of a great idea around how do you stop the shrouding. Jeanette's talking about communities and how they've affected change locally. And in the report, and lots of people are saying, devolve more power then to local authorities who sit in between. Given we know that traditionally these deprived communities do not feel the trickle-down effect, local authorities have underinvested in these areas for a long period of time, as have other foundations, so they're not getting per capita the same amount of investment. What is the answer there? Is it right, and is it appropriate to give the local authorities the power to then pass it on, to then allow communities to have that say? Will that really happen? Will that work?
Again, a really tricky one, isn't it? There's no perfect answer to this, but I think there are some narratives and stories that we can tell that help to bring to bear a little bit of understanding about the power of engagement at those different levels of government. And I think at the heart of it is about how do you enact a system or a change where people trust in that vision, and not just in the vision, but they have some faith and belief in that policy is going to be enacted in practice, and not only is it going to be enacted in practice, but it's going to benefit me. So again, I know this all sounds really challenging and really idealistic, but I think that connectivity between those different actors in that system, you know, we might have quite a well-versed understanding of those different structures, but most people perhaps don't. So what they're hearing is a message about whether something is going to benefit them or it's not. Or what they're hearing is something that's happened before that was promised to work but didn't. Or what they're hearing is a story about how their mental health might be supported through a mechanism that they feel is inappropriate or that they know won't work. So at the heart of this, whatever level, it's about that connectivity between resource, funding, commissioning, but at that local level, what does that then mean in practice? And we've got some wonderful examples. So I'm going to share the example of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter just as one mechanism for trying to bridge that gap between policy and practice, and the need for really changing people's perceptions about what good work is, so that becomes a place-based concern, so that there is very much an aspiration that is realised in practice that if you come and work here in this region or in this locality, wherever that might be, that we will provide for you some good employment and that will have benefits for you. So I think it's about the creation of a shared movement, and also really importantly at all of those different levels that there becomes a sense of shared ownership. And that's something that I have been really struck by when I've explored some of these initiatives that are taking place in our region. How if something's going to work, everybody has to have an awareness of what it is, but they also have to feel like they have that genuine ownership over it. And only in engaging directly with those communities can you do that. And engaging those levels of engagement between government and leadership and with businesses and with organisations, so that the two work hand in hand and those organisations buy into the idea, and by proxy the employees within those organisations begin to understand what's going to happen and how it's going to benefit them. So obviously you need those strong political influences, you need those strong political drivers at all of those different levels to resource the initiatives and support the formalisation of them, I should say. And that helps to generate this sense of sort of place-based movements that embed that meaningful change. And it's about raising the awareness of whether these things can work in practice, and we know that they do if they are resourced adequately and they're positioned for longevity, which may transcend, if you like, any political persuasion, because they are genuinely shared by everybody who interacts with them. But it's not an easy answer.
No, but I think it does raise something which kind of speaks to, I think, what Jay was saying about being brave, and you were talking about kind of transcending the kind of politics of it into something which feels deliverable, practical and meaningful for local people. So yeah, not easy, but I think, Jay, bringing you in on this, that the point you made around bravery, there is government policy around make work pay, and particularly from your membership. So I'm curious about, from what Sarah's saying, there's a theory here about how this should work. Practically, how are you seeing it play out?
I think what others have said is, I don't think the government policy alone won't fix this in the same way. You know, we spoke. You know, we've had New Deal for communities. You invest this money, that hasn't changed the places where I grew up. You've seen maybe new buildings be built, and you know, like the Towns Fund now. You know, you see a lovely, you know, slightly improved, shiny high street in a city centre. It doesn't make anyone's job better. It doesn't make their life immediately better. They're meant to be part of things you do to ultimately make people's lives better. So I think, you know, things like the New Deal for workers, make work pay, as it's now been kind of branded. You know, that's the new floor. It's what additional things we do, and how that actually becomes a reality in people's lives. You know, I think if you look at the making work pay, and it's interesting the report's touched on this, I do genuinely think the biggest transformative effect of these changes is going to be that kind of commitment to a secure contract that makes a real difference in people's lives. You know, you can give people £1 an hour more, £10 an hour more, £20 an hour more, but if you haven't got certainty that you're going to get 10 hours or 20 hours or 30 hours a week, it makes not a jot of difference. And I think that could be genuinely life-changing for lots of people in sectors where they have no power. They can't make their employer act differently, so government has to do those things. The big question then is where in local authority areas or in combined authority areas we can do that little bit more and be brave. And I think what I've seen the mention before around, you know, in the report about skills or health, there's a whole swathe of challenges, but when businesses are wanting to locate you, and Andy as a mayor, or Steve in Liverpool as mayors, or Tracy in Yorkshire are thinking about what they're going to do, how are they making their money go that little bit further? What policies do they have to make sure it creates something meaningful to people? That isn't just, you know, we were talking about Blackpool before, use that as an example. They build a brand new office, DWP. That's brilliant if you work in there. But most people in Blackpool aren't working in there. And they just want a good job. They just want a decent life. They want good opportunities for their kids. And this will be costly. I think we've got to kind of, you know, government talks about mission-based. You know, government, this has got to be a mission for the country, how we make, you know, work good. Because if not only do you spend a significant amount of your time there, but it has a real lasting impact on people's lives. We were talking just before, it was Joseph Rowney Foundation done a report quite a number of years ago now, but if you're in low pay early on in your career and stay in it for a particular amount of time, you stay in low pay for life. That has a lasting impact on you as an individual and your life chances and opportunities that you get to do. It has a significant impact on children, child poverty and deprivation. It has a significant impact on the local economy. It's not money you spend locally. You know, you're not supporting communities, and it's, you know, it's no surprise in a way that some of these areas kind of feature in this report, because they are areas where predominantly the jobs that exist there are low pay, you know, insecure, not particularly kind of valued or respected, and we've got to change that. And I think there's only so much government can do, that I think there's a responsibility for employers. But then I think, as was touched upon before, when you look at local areas. What can mayors or local authority leaders do? What's the physical change for people? I think people have to feel the change is doing something for them, not just a spreadsheet that says, oh, we've spent this much and the GVA's done this. That matters not a bit. I can't spend GVA in the shop. I've got to be able to feel that something that's had money spent on is worthwhile and lasting and beneficial to me. And I think buses is a significant thing. I think that transport infrastructure investment creates a real difference to local communities, local economies, gives lots of people opportunities for jobs or for travel or school. And it's from that one investment. It's how can we make that pound you spend on them buses work harder for us? Well, you look at what Andy's done in Greater Manchester. He's brought buses back under public control, the £2 fare cap that, hopefully will stay in place. That means more people can get to jobs in different parts of Greater Manchester, improves their life chances. They can travel, visit friends, family, go to local communities and spend. But at the same time, he's made sure that the bus companies who deliver those bus franchises are signed up to the Good Employment Charter and have to be paying their staff good pay and have decent terms and conditions. So that investment into buses that Andy's generated is doing more than just get someone from A to B a little bit quicker or under a nice shiny yellow bus. It's doing a little bit more for people, and people feel that. They see they see the buses, looks lovely, but they feel it's making a difference to them. And I think that's what, building on what government does nationally, how can we get local authorities, businesses, combined authorities, mayors, others, actors, leaders, all of us to do that little bit more to really make it a reality for people, that if it makes a difference to their lives.
That's really interesting, and I think we've started talking almost about individual areas and layered with this idea around how do you transform bad jobs. So, talking about secure contracts, shrouding, and other means of making it more accessible in terms of geography, buses, connections. I suppose I'm interested in the views of all of you actually now on, we're talking about communities in a very general way. So when we started looking at the numbers that Dan shared, and Dan might have something from the report on this as well, talking about 699 wards, over 1,000 neighbourhoods. They're all quite distinct. So, Dan was talking about coastal communities, post-industrial, spread across the country. Although we're drawing out, I think, some lessons, some trends, some things we think would be generally useful. I suppose I'm curious into whether we know communities are so diverse, they're so different, they have different skills, they have different assets, they have different pools. So when we think about Blackpool and how different that might be from somewhere in just Wigan or Dissington and the areas based across the country, what's your sense, I suppose, we'll get to my question, like how much can we draw on those kind of national policies versus what's right locally might vary hugely? And it might be a social capital question, but I'm just trying to draw that link. David, it looks like you're ready to go.
Look, clearly there are differences. By the way, I'm sure for everybody in the room, you look at those numbers, they're hard to engage in. I feel like I, in my mind, go back to when I was doing a PhD many, many years ago, a long time ago, and I worked on many so-called trouble estates, and I still think of those people and those times, and they do vary a lot. I mean, there was a particular contrast. One I worked in Peterborough, which was physically in very, very good condition. If you look at the housing stock, it was excellent, but it was characterized by really strong isolation that you often see, and you had a very particular layout, something called a Radburn layout, about the traffic worked, and it had a different solution to do with that than another estate I worked on down in Runcorn, actually, which is Legoland. Anybody remember that? Anyway, which was this kind of brutalist housing. Very different set of issues in lots of ways. But what you often do see in coming through, and hence the whole point about local trust work on double disadvantage, is that the social capital story is a part of the story. Social capital, we talk about other kinds of capital, human capital, skills, etc. Your social networks and the level of trust within them are enormously valuable. They are really valuable to you in the world. They are valuable to your well-being. If you're sick, does someone bring you chicken soup? If you need a job, your kid, who's in your network? They're incredibly valuable, and they're not taken account of. Similarly, we don't even take account of a lot of course, the informal aspects of what happens in our lives. We literally don't include it in our GDP numbers, right? If you go and help your neighbor's kids next door. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised. It's like a black hole in our account of the world, literally our accounts, And this looks like it's a common element that we haven't got a grip on. The last thing I just say on it is there's some recent work, particularly from the US, a guy called Raj Chetty, for those who know it, who's been looking at this again, and people, I think, are being incredibly shocked by the size of the effect. So when you talk about this kid and who do they know, or who do they not, Raj has been showing not only in your neighbourhood, but literally down to the class you are in, the school class you are in, the luck of the draw. If you are in a class with the right bunch of kids who's got one or two parents with the right networks, it almost wipes the floor with every other variable.
Yes.
Forget race, socioeconomic background. It's unbelievably important. We're doing work at the moment on that in the UK to see, we're seeing some of the same effect sizes. So the question, what do you do about that? Now, there'll be some variation to it. A lot of it is the skill and the weaving of, well, who is it here in this neighbourhood? You know, can I introduce you, Mr. Brown, to, you know, Mr. Smith over here and, you know, go and have a drink together or whatever. But you're either going to try and you rebuild it, particularly the weak ties. So, I mean, very neat work around someone called Sherry Cateau doing stuff around, if a teacher wants to say, who can I bring into the classroom in my school to expose people to? And there's a hypothesis and there's some evidence. If kids just meet a few people who are kind of social entrepreneurs, they'd actually would have an option. Hey, here's someone who works in the city. Oh my God, I've never met a person like that before. They just solve the problem for the teacher. Who are you going to write to? They use a combination of LinkedIn, right, to figure out who in the geography, who's a social entrepreneur. They also check it against companies' house records to see, actually, is this person successful? That'd be quite a good point. And then they solved it for the teacher to bring someone in. So then you're replacing. And your other alternative, which is that you change the rules of the game completely. So, look, I'm really aware of it. My kids are in their 20s. You know, I'm able to help them and introduce them to people in a way that the kid you talked about didn't have that, right? So either you can build the networks, or you can say, let's make a world where it doesn't rely on that in the same way. And I'll just give you a simple example on the labour market. 4 million people in gig economy. They are managed by very sophisticated market players. You know them all, you get your meal delivered by them. Imagine you're working for one of these companies. It's going to pop up on your phone. It's going to say, will you deliver this pizza for £4.50? You've got 60 seconds to decide, right? That's your life. Can you even work out what's the marginal rate of the cost, etc.? So there's a really neat little startup called Rodeo that enables people to export their data in the gig economy and work out which platform actually pays them the best rate, and then, because they normally work for several platforms. It's really hard to do the math. On the other side, you've got massive, data science to figure out how can we drive the cost down to, these workers. Imagine you flip it the other way around, where they're working the other way around. So they're really neat. By the way, they are being sued by one of those networks who are saying, changing the contracts to say, you're not allowed to share that information. Guess why? Because you can see they're the worst payer. So there are interventions here that are possible.
Thanks, David. Jeanette?
I was just going to say, one of the big issues for work as well for areas is that transition, which is talked about in the report, from benefit into work as well, which is huge for people. A friend of mine works as a careers advisor, and she was saying that parents don't want their kids to get apprenticeships because it has a knock-on effect on what income they receive. Those things aren't taken into consideration either. And we know that when somebody loses their benefit for whatever reason, trying to get back there is a full-time job. So we need to be looking seriously at that and make, that's why things like bursaries are so important. But for goodness sake, we could do that through the system. If we were brave, if we took leaps of faith and we actually trusted that people want to work and don't just write them off.
Absolutely. Sarah, did you want to come in on that as well?
Just 2 points. I think the first one is the sheer power of role modelling and socialisation. If we all think back, whatever our backgrounds, people who have inspired us in different ways, I can think of 4 or 5 examples in my sort of early education and career and family members and whoever it might be, somebody that you might know by proxy. They are massively important forces. And there's clearly a challenge, isn't there, in these sorts of situations where that's not as readily accessible for people. But the second was coming back to the point about sort of the grouping together of doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods versus their distinctiveness. And it reminded me of a project that I worked on with a colleague, Professor Carol Atkinson, back in, I think it was about 2015, and it was for the Welsh Government, and we were doing a lot of work in social care. And we were looking at domiciliary home care workers in Wales, across the whole of Wales, who went out to visit people to provide care in their homes. And there's a massive issue with the marginalisation of that workforce in general. It's completely undervalued, yet it's one of the most important, highly responsible jobs that you can do in the world. You're literally the only person that is going to visit that individual, and you are quite literally keeping them alive. So I feel very, very strongly about that. But the point we were making in terms of that, the need for professionalisation of these bad jobs, if you like, that are typically having poor employment terms and conditions. The geographical point there that I was going to provide was that in South Wales, you see quite a diversity in the geographical landscape. And so what we mean really is sort of towns, countryside, city, rural areas. And so at the time when we had employment terms and conditions and domiciliary care work, which meant that if you were doing 10 visits a day, you'd only get paid for the visits that you did, the time that you were delivering that care, not the travel time between those visits. That actually had very different implications for good employment if you were in a region that wasn't as rural. So in those rural regions, people will be travelling for 20 or 30 miles between those visits. So I think there's some really distinct challenges for good work across geographical locality potentially. Thanks, Sarah.
I think I feel when I think about this is, and the scale of the report says this, there's so many diverse places, and it's very easy to think, well, if we just do this thing. And I think government understandably sometimes thinks that, well, we're going to do this is the policy, and this is, I worked in a job centre for a little while. It was the tail end of Gordon Brown and the David Cameron government, and all of the initiatives were nationally led. It was, here's what we're going to do. So you have the Future Jobs Fund. The big difference that I seen was that under Gordon Brown's government, the Future Jobs Fund had funding for people to go out locally and match people up to jobs in local community. And then kind of what's left then under what was Ian Duncan Smith's leadership at DWP was essentially it's just a national programme to support people, get people into work. There was no kind of help that was very local and specific. The government needs to empower people to do some of this, but give genuine power. And maybe people involved in Devo here. Devolution we have now isn't power. It's actually just Treasury giving you pots of money with some strings attached, telling you what you can spend it on and how you can spend it and how often you can spend it. It's not genuine power. It's pots of money. And I think we should give pots of money, but we should devolve power. And I'll be honest, we shouldn't just devolve that to mayors or council leaders. They work on political cycles. That comes into their political machinations. It should be working with big local. It should be working with the academics. It should be working with the trusted people in local communities, workers, businesses, and saying, right, okay, we've got some money, whatever that pot of money is in our local area, what can we do with it? We've got £1 million, £2 million, £3 million, and we're not going to just build something so I get a lovely photo in front of, a digger with a high vis on. We're going to do this, and it's going to invest some of the money, but the commitment is that it won't just be invest so that you grow your business and you can hire 2 people. It's you'll hire 2 people and you will do this in terms of employment for them. You'll do this in terms of skills. We'll do this in terms of job opportunities or just enrich people's lives, fulfillment opportunities. We kind of just have to be, I think, not just brave in our decision making, but brave in making it happen and say, no, unless you do all of these things, you don't get the money, because it's a scarce resource as such that government will face, and we've got to really make it work hard for us. And I think your analogy before about empowering just really resonated, to think that it is just that, it's that we will shine a light, but it's our light and you're not in control of it, and we'll turn it off when we want to turn it off. And if the bulb goes, well, we've got no money to replace it, and that's really problematic for thinking about lasting change in a way that then hopefully won't need government intervention and spending, that communities can then do some of it and build up from within.
Yeah, and I think Dan used a really nice phrase in his report around definition not being destiny, and how we make that true for a lot more communities than is currently the case. I think we're now going to open it up to questions from the audience. I think there's a roving mic. There we go, that Dan's got. So what we're going to do is, if there's a few questions, we might take 2 or 3 at the time, and I'll ask panel just to take a note of the questions and think about the ones you want to answer. If there's somebody you particularly want to answer your question, then just let us know. But I think we'll start with you, Bill, over here.
Thank you. I'm actually from a big local family, and I live in a coastal community. And I really do identify what Jeanette said. We've tried using some of that £1 million to encourage apprenticeships. We've said to people that we can pay for you to get to these places, we can pay for you to get home. And the biggest sticking point is an apprenticeship is an income. If you live with a family who live on universal credit, they will take an equal sum from that benefit, and that affects your family. If you're a jam, just about making it, so you've got a little job, it doesn't affect you that way, you can get away with it. And I see so many children hanging on the streets who would be better employed with an apprenticeship, and they are keen to do it, but the family can't afford to let them do it because they consider that £84 a week. And the solution is, if we made it education, then it would be a disregard. As an income, it wouldn't be.
Thanks, Ben. I think there was a lady in the cardigan there.
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm from Good Things Foundation. We're the UK's leading digital inclusion charity. And I know that connectivity has been discussed mainly on behalf of, fantastic public transport, things like buses in Manchester. And I know that within the report, connectivity does also allude to and talks quite directly about digital, particularly internet connectivity. Now, the digital divide doesn't just take into account internet connectivity, it also talks about things like devices or things like that, linking to social capital and social infrastructure slightly, the kind of confidence and skills and trust in the internet itself. And my question for the panel is about the digital divide. What do you think kind of shines through when it comes to these doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods, and what can the government and other policymakers do about it?
Thank you. Have we got any more questions? Oh, one at the back. Kate there. And then...
Thank you. Kate Hainsworth. I'm a trustee with a local trust and work on the Fair Work Charter in West Yorkshire. I'm particularly interested in some of the points the panel were making around doing things a bit different. I think everybody has mentioned trying to do things a bit different. And I think what Dan said at the beginning was the experience in doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods is often down to a whole plethora of factors. So if we're actually trying to do things different across a whole plethora of factors, could this either be the driver, because if you get it right for doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods, you're probably going to get it right elsewhere, the kind of point the gentleman made over there, or are we feeling a bit more negative about this, that everybody's feeling the pinch and are too scared to do something a bit different right now?
Thank you. There's a lady here, and then I'll turn to the panel after this question for answers.
Hi, I'm Emily from the Living Wage Foundation. I was really interested to kind of hear about how, the benefits where this work is maybe working sort of a city level or regional level aren't reaching these neighbourhoods. And, we do a lot of work in Greater Manchester around living wage places, which has really seen a growth of living wage employers in a local area. But I just wonder how can kind of these established campaigns that are tackling some of these issues, how can we come together or make it possible that organisations like ours are able to reach the neighbourhoods, which most organisations, when you look at the volume that there are, it's structurally really difficult to work out how can we invest our resources and make change at a really localised level. So yeah, really interested to hear thoughts on that.
Thanks, Emily. I'm looking at the panel to see if anyone's desperate to dive in with any of the questions. One of the things I think, Dan, the report talks about is the digital divide, which is, I don't know whether you want to say just a little bit more before the panel answers the question.
We were talking about it beforehand, and so it was fresh in my mind, and then I forgot to mention it at the podium. But the digital factoid that we have in the report is, I think it's something like 85 or 86% of doubly disadvantaged neighbourhoods are in the category of, as communities, the least engaged with the internet, with digital devices, and 46% of the people in doubly disadvantaged communities, compared to 8% for the country as a whole, are in the category of people who essentially don't interact at all with digital devices. So it's really acute, and I think of the areas where doubly disadvantaged communities stick out from from other communities in England, that question of the digital divide is probably the most pronounced. So I think, David, it's maybe a little bit of a challenge back to the idea that that could be the big opportunity, depending on whether you think that's glass half full or glass half empty.
Do you want to respond, David?
Yeah, I don't mind. Great question. Look, this point about the apprenticeship, by the way, that's absolutely shocking and like the kind of thing, let's try and nail that, surely. On some of the other points, and by the way, it's exactly the kind of thing that governments do, right? They're like, oh my God, we just haven't lived through this, because Whitehall isn't full of people like that, right? Those experiences. On some of the other ones, around the different kinds of, particularly in this relationship with the digital as well as the physical, Bob Putnam uses an interesting phrase now, who's sort of father of social capital. In fact, by the way, if you're interested, his documentary is about to go on Netflix for those who are digitally connected, which is called Join or Die. It's coming out, I think, tomorrow on his work, particularly in the US. Anyway, watch out for that. But he uses this phrase sometimes about alloys, which is that, people used to juxtapose, it really mattered for your well-being how many friends you've got. It really does. It doesn't matter how many friends you've got on Facebook. It makes no difference whatsoever. Because most people live in a world where they're blended. So the person who you most often WhatsApp or whatever is probably someone who you live with, right? But so they've kind of become woven together in really quite interesting and important ways. They don't stand separate anymore, and understanding that's really important. One thing aside about on the money, look, I'm an ultra. I'm literally wearing a badge. I love evidence. I think one of the problems is it's half full, half empty. Is that most government policy is not evaluated. So we are spending more than $1 trillion a year. We'd have no idea which of it works. We can't even make the advertising claim, we know half of it works, we just don't know which half. If only we knew half of it worked. We don't know that at all. And it's also reflected in terms of the research. So UKRI, the big UK funder, spends $9 billion a year. What percentage of that is spent on social, political, basically about 2%, 2 to 3%. We spend it, and if you're sick, you want to have good cancer drugs, etc. But the challenges we're talking about in the room are also really interesting challenges to pick apart. Well, what was the active ingredient? What worked and what didn't? Like on the physical housing stuff, if I think about that Radburn layout, the houses were basically fine, but a Radburn layout, means that the way you drive up to the back of the house, so you never go out the front door, and it has this consequence that you never get to know your neighbours, and then the way in which, so it turned out some very cheap interventions could alter that dynamic. So to understand the active ingredient means that maybe you can spend the same money genuinely much, much more effectively. So one of the things I think we should be pushing for is, particularly on more radical interventions, is like, well, for God's sake, let's not do them nationally. But yeah, let's encourage some local areas to try some really genuinely radical things. But the quid pro quo is, for God's sake, we need it evaluated robustly. Yeah. And I know I've given Matt Leach at Local Trust a lot of hassle over this over the years. Like, for God's sake, make sure we've got as strong as evidence base we can as we go along to figure it out. So, and I think that we have to have the patience to do that again. That we want to do it straight away, but at the very least, let's try out some things, figure out what works. What does an amazing community organizer do that the rest of us haven't figured out? And then let's see if we can learn that lesson. The last thing, there was a question about what can you do getting into some of these areas. It's really difficult. I mean, again, we might try out some. I mean, a classic one is sometimes chain recruitment. It's very hard because you heard the stories. You understand. How would you get to that young person with 4 generations? It's going to be really hard work. But if you can get to a few of them, you can start to do chain recruitment. And so it may be worth going to a lot of effort to start getting a few early recruits from certain geographies, let alone also thinking about on the investment side, are there certain kinds of activities which can be, so you can pull apart the geography. I'll give you a concrete example. It doesn't all have to be like, we're all going to learn to code. So I live in the southeast, right? Fine, that's great, lots of ways. But if you've got a window, this is a real example, right? You need a window in a rotten old building. You can spend a fortune on a joiner who'll come along and do it. Or you can go to Travis Perkins and buy one which is not the right size, right? Neither of these are very good options. It happens to be, there's a small number of companies in Britain, one of which is really good in a very deprived area actually, which you just send them the dimensions of your window. It's not that complicated, and then they build you one that size. It's the same price as Travis Perkins. I'm being a bit down on them today. And it's the right size. Like, it doesn't have to be geography. It's much, much more efficient. And so that's an example of what a catch-up variable would look like. Well, actually, it doesn't have to be done in the southeast. It could be done somewhere else, and blah, blah, blah. So why isn't the economy working well enough to release these kind of gains and get these employment, moving around? And I think an activist local government and some canny investment can move that as well.
Just very quickly on the digital divide as well, in terms of getting jobs, a lot of people are now using AI to do their CVs, to do their applications. That again means that people that aren't au fait or able are getting cut out. Not only is AI putting them together, but AI is deciding who gets through as well. So I'm not sure where we're going with that. It scares the shit out of me, to be honest. But anyway, the other bit I'd like to just answer is about doing it differently. And I'd just like to bring to you something that I was involved in the 80s. It was something, I'm so old, it was called the Voluntary Projects Programme under Manpower Services Commission. And we set up something called the Retford Employment and Unemployment Action Centre, and we just called it the Action Centre. And what it did was it listened to what was going on around it. There was 3 areas to start with, which was setting up businesses, and workers' cooperatives were in vogue at the time, so there was a lot of money going into that. There was there was practical volunteering. The red tape around volunteering now would probably stop that working. And then there was something about bits of education as well. But what we did was we completely developed all of that by listening to people as they were coming in. So we did something called Working in the Community Volunteers. I took a whole load of people down a pit and things like that. And we did a bit of just raising awareness and talking with other organisations to get people some work experience. And we did a very holistic support job, which is, I think it just makes sense, but it just doesn't happen. Even the hubs at the moment are just around specific areas. But we had self-help groups that came out of people who were coming into the centres. We had people like Relate coming in and having a room. We had people like the Cooperative Development Agency. We worked on a scratch-back situation with all these organisations because we didn't have the money to bring them in, etc. But we made space for them. And we made their appointments so they didn't have to worry about it. And we could say to them, don't come today because we haven't got anybody ready to see you. So we had self-help, we had working in the community, we had courses from North Notts College of FE coming in and delivering. We developed our own tutors as well so that they could actually reach people. And very often as well, one of the things was we never turn anybody away without something. So whoever came in the door got something out of it. And it was a bit, we sort of worked off the Samaritans premise that whatever they came in with was generally the presenting problem. You had to talk to them and get behind that and find out exactly what was going on before they could make the choice of what they wanted to do. And we handheld. If we had to send them out the door, we handheld into the next organisation. All of that, of course, takes people power. You can give people as many buildings as you want, but unless you've got people in them, the buildings are just going to stand empty. We need to make sure that you've got the right people supporting people and talking to them in a way that's respectful and supportive rather than judgmental and dismissive.
Thanks, Jeanette. And looking, Jay, Sarah, the question about whether you're feeling on the negative end of things or there's the pinch of positivity. Where are you landing at the moment, and in terms of responding to the complexity and kind of what is required? What's your sense of where we are?
I think it's overwhelming, isn't it, for all of us, because this feels like a massive a massive challenge and a very long-standing challenge. And I think the key, from a sort of behavioural change, culture change perspective, all of this takes a significant amount of lots of different resources: time, commitment, genuine compassion in building trust, and all of those other things. So there's the financial element, and then there's also that sort of lived experience sort of element, and a massive skills gap, I think, across all of these. We keep mentioning all of these different levels in the system, all of these different actors in the system, all of these different roles. And I think even just going back to the sort of, when we were talking about the digital divide, there's the financial constraints that block access to that. But moreover, there is a skills issue, there's a confidence issue, there's a credibility issue, there's a readiness for engagement in a society which for the most part relies upon all of those things and has done for some time. So I think in terms of the negativity, there's still that pervading feeling of being forgotten about in lots of different ways, which is actually very, very harrowing. But at the same time, I think we see some real pockets of hope, don't we, in some of these really informal innovations, those stories we hear of where people have been particularly inspired or have learned to up their expectations based on seeing or hearing the experiences of somebody else who's had a really positive experience. So it's difficult. I mean, for me, I feel really optimistic because I know that we have lots of skills we can use to help, but whether those wider infrastructures are there to allow that to come to fruition in the way it needs to, it is always going to be a broader sort of landscape problem. Thank you.
I won't, for the benefit of the time, come back on all of the things because I was literally scribbling notes on them. But just on that power to about what you were saying about apprenticeships, we spoke before about giving power out. We also got to have power to say it back and be heard, and I think that comes to your point before about that, that trial and innovation and figure things out. I used to work in the civil service and the passport office and the job centre, and every pilot, it was never a pilot, it was just the start of them doing something. They were never going to learn or evaluate, and that same thing plays out in government. What I would say to that idea of negativity or positivity around this is, listen, it's challenging. I would not want to be, and you wouldn't want me to be, Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves right now making some of these decisions. But I try and think, for me, when I look at this and think whether it's a negative, it's more of a worry and the scale of the challenge and the need to do these things. But we have to try and find a way. When I spoke at a National Pensioners Convention, and there was a question of, can we afford an ageing population? And I sat there looking at a room of people that looked like my nan and granddad, thinking, I don't know what happens if I say no. Like, do you get locked in this room and we never see you and bye nan kind of thing? So is we are faced with this challenge and we have to address it. Nobody else is going to come along and do it. People are not going to magic themselves out of poverty. They're not going to magic themselves into kind of less deprived neighbourhoods. It's going to require all of us, whether government and business and community actors, to do something. And in that, we should see some opportunity. We should see some opportunity to say that next time Dan or local trust are writing this report in 5 years' time, we've got to change of government, whatever your political persuasions, that is a change. Is in 5 years' time, when we're sitting in a room like this, what are we saying? That, in 33 of those 699 places, we tried some of the things. We did some stuff around digital connectivity or about buses or about good jobs, and has it made a difference? We should trial them. We should try it. We should empower people. And that's going to need a bit of money, but there's a cost, both financially to the economy, but to people if we don't. And that's the real thing we should be thinking about here. This will cost us if we don't. The people sitting in this room in 5-10 years' time saying, if we haven't done nothing on these things, the scale of...
And that's probably quite a good note to end on, but Jeanette, go on.
Oh, very quick one. I just want to say one thing. We talk about cost all the time. Why don't we just change that word to invest? We're investing in our people. They're not costing us. Thank you.
David's got a final point.
Well, the same, to go a step further, which is that, like on Hold the People, you're going to go with it, is that people are assets. Like, they're in these communities. They have time, they have skills, they have capability. One of the beautiful things about social capital, in contrast with other capital, most capitals, when you use them, then they get consumed, like environmental capital. Social capital doesn't work like that. If you start to form a friendship and you reciprocate, you actually make more social capital. Yeah. Particularly women seem to do a lot of this, and men, whatever. Like, you actually it has this characteristic. And so it's more than an aside where we say we don't cost and capitalise, we don't see the value of it. And I'll just tell you one story, if you'll bear with me. Where we had a housing minister a few years ago who was looking at, because a lot of these deprived areas often have high contents of social housing and so on, and it's like we were looking at the maintenance bills, which are billions and billions. And we reckon that at least $1 billion of it a year was stuff that people could just kind of do themselves. It's like painting a window or whatever, right? So why can't we just give the money to the estates, and like people on the estates give it to the organisers, they'll do it. It's like an episode of Yes Minister. It's like, well, Minister, but I don't know. Yeah, but hang on, how would that really work, Minister? Well, just give them money. Well, who are you giving it to? Of course, appropriate questions. Right? But someone's going to have to go up a ladder, and then when they fall down the ladder, whose ladder is it, and are we going to get sued? You can sort of imagine the loop this goes through, which is, on the face of it, a really sensible thing, and you come up with all the reasons why we can't do it. But inherently, of course these communities are going to be able to, they should get that £1 billion. Why can't they maintain themselves? So can we have the wit and the wisdom to see that it's not just costs, it's unrealised assets and capabilities that people got, which we need to oil the works off and support and give the tools to those communities so they can use their own assets.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And to the whole panel for contributing today and being a part of the discussion. I think it's been really interesting, and I think touched on many of the points which are hopefully captured in the report. So the reports are in front of you. We'll share it on social media. Please do share it on. We're going to invite you now for, I think, tea, coffee, drinks and cake. And just a big thank you again to CPP and to my colleagues at Local Trust for putting this all together and spending the time on it. So thank you for joining us as well.